Hi there, I'm Andreas Marazis, and I'm the host of the ENC In-Depth podcast. Today's in-depth discussion is dedicated to the recently published ENC Analysis, 1 decade after the 2011 Uprisings, Islamist Militancy in Middle East North Africa as an EU security threat by Dr. Ebtisam Hussein. The debate is part of the ENC In-Depth podcast discussions with experts and academics assessing the developments in Middle East and North Africa in the fields of security, foreign policy, economy, democracy, and education. But let me introduce my virtual companion for today's podcast discussion, who is currently based in South China. Dr. Ebtisam Hussein is an ENC Academic Council member, Associate Professor of Political Science at Cairo University, and since February 2019, she serves as Associate Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Sun Yat-sen University in China. Dr. Hussein's research focus comprises the Egyptian military, Islamism, repressive practices in the public sphere, and post-2011 Middle East North African uprisings. She was awarded several international scholarships, such as the Cultural Exchange Program in Japan in 2005, and a Fulbright grant to study US politics and thought in 2006. Ebtisam, welcome to the ENC In-Depth podcast. Thank you for being available for today's meeting.
Thanks, dear Andreas. I'm actually so thrilled to be on the podcast. This is the first time for me, as you may know, because I joined the ENC last year. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm really delighted. Thank you.
The honor is all ours to have you on our board, and I'm pleased that we managed to find, considering the time difference between China and Europe, to find available date and time to have this discussion dedicated to your paper. Now, let me start by asking you, in your paper, you mentioned, and I quote, that in order to enhance its own member states' security, the EU is compelled to seek updated knowledge and assessment of militancy in neighboring countries. Let's start our discussion by asking you to please elaborate on that and explain what the EU has done so far and how we should we cooperate with our neighbors to deal with terrorism.
Well, as you can tell from the entire paper, Andreas, the paper is about a different perspective. It's a non-security perspective. Like, I'm not trying to say, oh, maybe the European Union should actually do more to protect the citizens in terms of military or intelligence efforts. They are doing great. Like, we have to acknowledge the fact that the different organizations of the European Union that are in charge of the defense and security are actually doing a great job. And they are paying enormous efforts towards enhancing the security and promoting the safety of EU citizens. But actually, the paper is more inclined to take the non-security perspective, which is to watch out for grievances in neighboring countries. This is what I was trying to say. Like, okay, it's a connected world, it's globalization, guys, and this has implications for security priorities, or security decision-making. Like, the EU is now living as part of a very connected globe. I'm not here speaking about the fact that the Middle East and North Africa is quite close. I'm not talking about the geographic proximity here. I'm more or less talking about the fact that you can be sitting in maybe Mexico and planning and orchestrating a terrorist attack inside Spain, for example. So it's really scary because if you have terrorists, this is the bottom line. If you have terrorists, then virtually every country is under threat. So put into consideration the additional factor of the geographic proximity when we come to particularly discuss the MENA, like the Middle East and North Africa. It makes it kind of easier with lots of people who are living today inside the EU coming from the MENA originally, either that they grew up there as a second or third generation of immigrants, or that they actually commute to one of the EU countries under the different allegations. We already know that in the last few years, we had the EU already had millions of refugees because of the MENA uprisings and other security and economic hardships in MENA. They had millions of refugees coming originally from MENA. So with these developments, the EU really has to pay more attention to what's going on in MENA. And when I talk about what's going on in MENA, I'm talking precisely about the grievances that feed the terrorist organizations and let them thrive.
You speak about grievances, and I have, a reasonable question in the sense grievances caused by Europe's troubled past in these countries. Grievances because probably people who traveled or migrated for whatever reason in Europe have not been integrated properly, or they are considered second or third tier citizens in host countries. My question here is what did, according to your opinion, drive and motivate terrorists to attack European countries?
That's a very good question. Thanks. I already touched upon that in the paper in maybe a paragraph or so, but let's elaborate on it because you can speak about the colonial legacy or the history of colonizers in the Middle East and North Africa, but it's more than that. It's not just about, colonizers exploited our resources, they left us behind, they pretended to be working for our sake, but they weren't. You can have this kind of argument, but mainly Europe is now being attacked either because from an ideological perspective that it represents for the terrorist organizations, of course, that they represent the non-religious or the atheist, the secular, put it under whatever, they want to name it. And this is, of course, a very naive and reductionist understanding conception, but actually it's being used by terrorist organizations. But the other side, which is maybe more relevant and empirical, has to do with the fact that, as you just mentioned, there are many MENA immigrants or refugees who live inside the EU, but are disenfranchised and marginalized. When I used to do when I spent 4 consecutive years in Germany because of my PhD, there was this huge debate about whether the Turks are really integrated enough. And the fact that even inside Germany, there were intellectuals who were accusing the German government of not doing enough in order to integrate the Turkish migrants, those who live there for the second or third generation. But the debate is everywhere. It's not just in Germany. It's all about, do you let these people live in ghettos? They believe that they have different values. They concentrate in specific neighborhoods, and they do not feel the state being there for them. Some of them do not even speak proper language in terms of the country's language. If they live in Germany, they have a very strong accent, and maybe they are not so good in written German. And the same for other countries. So the fact that you believe that you're different, you live in the EU, you have you're part of the you're subjected to the sovereignty of the country where you're living, but at the same time, socially speaking, you do not belong. And we can tell from many attacks that the EU encountered in the last 20 years, especially the massive attacks of Paris and Brussels, and Spain actually, the ones that I highlighted in my paper, they were not just about being so fatal, so brutal, and of course that they have been directed to civilian targets. But actually, it's because in many instances, though the culprits, people who did it, many of them were living inside the EU, and they complied to these criteria that I just highlighted. They lived there, their parents were there, maybe they were even born inside the EU, and they spoke the language. Still, they felt different. They were easily manipulated by terrorist organizations in MENA whether in Syria, in Iraq, you name it, and they were used in order to carry out the brutal attacks that happened. We know how the internet is playing a role in that.
I just wanted to comment on something that you mentioned, that like you have experienced when you were living in Germany about like the integration of Turkish population there, the Turkish groups. I used to live for quite some time in Belgium, and especially in Brussels, and I spent at least like 3-4 years in a neighborhood, in a commune that had a large number of Turkish population living there. So, I mean, they were not living in ghetto, but what I realized, and I think that's the case in other countries that they host such communities, such large communities, is that Turkish people or Moroccan people, they tend to support their own, meaning that if they have shops, groceries, supermarkets, they buy from each other. They support, I mean, at least that's like from someone who's an observer, and I'm not talking about as a researcher right now, what I did in-depth interviews and so on. But what I realized is that they support their own people, and they buy from their own people like products, and they sell to their own restaurants and so on, big quantities and so on of their products. Now, maybe that's because they believe that this way they only help each other, because maybe they don't feel integrated, maybe because they feel that the government or the authorities, they don't help them any other way, so they support each other. I'm not sure, but I didn't see any grievances or any problems, at least that's on the surface.
Well, I have to
and they spoke
share
the language, by the way, they spoke the language.
Yeah, sure. I was in Belgium in 2012. I delivered a lecture inside the European Parliament, and of course I've been around the country. Yeah, I've been, not the country, but the city of Brussels, and I ran into a couple of Moroccan, I believe, I think Moroccan, Algerian. Yeah, like they came mainly because of the French language from what we call the Arab Maghreb, part of MENA. And they were very nice. And of course, when they realized that I was Egyptian, they started talking in Arabic, they spoke fluently, and they were very nice, and you could tell they were doing fine. But of course, you can imagine they are not the ones that I ran into when I just spent 3 days in Belgium, were not the whole community. Yeah, and actually, I don't know, today in Germany, you can find physicians and dentists who are actually Turkish. Like they could improve and upgrade their social status inside Germany, especially talking about, there are some statistics about it. The third generation is actually very, how do you say, like they are not marginalized in terms of professions and in terms of education. But there are general patterns, yeah? Like, for example, you will find that maybe domestic violence is higher among Turkish families compared to the general population, or early marriages, or whatever. Like, there are still trends in terms of social conduct. And I do think because of the Brussels attacks that I mentioned in the paper, that there is a problem with integration in Belgium. Like they are not fully integrated, and you can easily tell from the details on the culprits, how they lived and their family backgrounds and how they coordinated the attacks. You can tell something was missing. But the best part about the EU security strategies is that they learn from what happens. Like, because of the Brussels attacks in 2016, there was more scrutiny and monitoring of the chemical materials that could be used in explosives. Because if you read about it, it's like they just used the chemicals for maybe a few weeks before they carried out the attacks. And there was some suspicion about why does it smell so odd from the apartment. So they kind of managed back then, but the EU is learning. is learning that, okay, this is how it happened. And the same with the French attacks, the use of the internet, the fact that you can use the internet to orchestrate not just to recruit your culprits, but also an associate, but also that you can use the internet in order to coordinate the attack itself. So now there is more scrutiny on how to use the internet, and there are mechanisms of how to shut down any website that is using certain words. It is somehow synonymous to what happened after 9/11 in the US. If you talk to someone over the phone and you mention one of few words, then you start tracking the call. But it's a different strategy, because you just within 1 hour you bring down any website that you suspect is being is promoting these kinds of ideas.
But let's take a step back and focus on what actually triggered the rise of Islamist militancy in Middle East and North Africa regions. Can you, in your paper, you provide several examples from countries, from 4 countries, if I'm mistaken. So can you please give one from Middle East and one from North Africa?
Well, as said, the uprisings, and this is why I had the title 1 decade after the MENA uprisings. The uprisings played a huge role in promoting these terrorist organizations. We all know that the security establishment was compromised in some MENA countries after the uprisings. And this gave some time and space for the terrorist organizations to thrive. It happened in Egypt, of course. If you know how things kind of unfolded in Egypt after the uprising, we had the Muslim Brothers for some time being actively engaged in politics, and then there was the 2013 okay, this is controversial, but anyways, the military came in and they took out the Muslim Brothers, and they were being persecuted for years, and now they are not, they're politically barred. They cannot participate in politics in Egypt. So, and this gave, even before they were out of power, even before the Muslim Brothers were out of power, there was some turbulence in the Sinai region. I already recently I co-wrote a paper about it, about the challenges for national security in Egypt after the uprising, after 2011. It's gonna come out in a few weeks, I suppose. It's a Swiss publication. So you can tell that it already happened even before the Muslim Brothers were out of power. But of course, they were exacerbated after the persecution of the Muslim Brothers. And Egypt had to deal with this security challenge for years. We still have some, we have people dying every now and then because of the Sinai security condition or status. But at the same time, the situation is in numbers, talking in numbers, is getting better. So Egypt is one example, although I have to stress that in Egypt, things weren't the same as they were, for example, in Syria or in Yemen or in Libya. No? So it has to do, you can, without any statistics, you can do the correlation between how long the political instability lingered and how severe the security status or the security challenge is, and also the terrorist thriving. These indicators, they kind of go together in the same direction. If it takes longer, then the security situation is compromised in a more severe way, and you have a better chance of terrorists thriving. So Egypt is actually not the best case in terms of talking about terrorism in post-2011 MENA. Maybe Libya is one, because of the whole division in the government and having allies. I already published a small opinion article in January 2021, like this year, about okay, it was more about the Turkish involvement in the struggle and the political conflict. But anyways, it's more or less about how the authority split that happened in Libya was actually getting the country into a mess. So Libya is the example if you're talking about North Africa. And in the Middle East is actually overlapping with North Africa. Like Egypt is both. Egypt is North Africa and is Middle East. Mm-hmm. But if you're talking about the Arab Peninsula, without a doubt, it would actually be Yemen is the big thing when it comes to the suffering, because of the fact, again, the longer the security challenge, the more the conflict itself takes on, and the thriving of the terrorist activities. One last thing on this point, it has to do with the fact that the premises of what happened after the uprisings was there in most of these countries before the uprisings. Like we already know that Al-Qaeda and then the Islamic State, its heir, had some presence in some MENA countries before the uprisings. It was just a good chance for them to thrive. And one of the references that I used in the paper, it was on Yemen. It was a very interesting reading. I do not recall the name right now, but if you check the references I used on this part, Yemen, it tells, the paper was telling more or less how entrenched the terrorist organizations are in the Yemeni society. And this is why it's kind of, they are resilient, they are so well entrenched in the society, and they could establish some legitimacy among segments of the Yemeni society. So you have to put that into consideration, that it's more, they exploited the security challenge in Yemen in order to build their base. And we're talking about millions of dollars that were under their control, like because of the bank lootings and the control they had on the oil exports of Yemen. It's crazy. Like they were taking things to another level in Yemen. So if you're talking about examples, MENA, maybe Libya, I cannot say what's more. Like I cannot say Syria or Iraq were the worst, but actually I would say Libya and Yemen were actually very good cases of how the security challenge gave some ground to the terrorist organizations.
No, thanks, Ebtisam. But let's take security challenges and power struggle among conflicting parties in these countries, in these regions, basically. Don't you think that socio-political conditions in these countries were also exacerbated, or not exacerbated, but actually provided fertile ground for jihadist ideology to really thrive and, you know, provide the foothold that they were looking like, and the possibility to, you know, acknowledge the fact that, okay, we can provide a different narrative for these people, for the societies? I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think?
This has been going on for years. As said before, they were there before the uprisings, and they could use the how do you say, the exceptional demise of the security establishment in order for them to thrive. But of course, when it comes to indoctrination, if this is what you're asking about, it, they kind of recruit people through the ideas. They're having ideas that look so attractive to them as an alternative.
Yeah.
It happens everywhere. Like Islamists, whether they are violent or not, they usually play on this part, which is that they are offering an alternative. If you, for example, read about Algerian or Sudanese Islamists, you will see that at one point of their modern history or histories, that Islamists kind of, I wouldn't say infiltrate, but they kind of establish their anchor in the society through offering this kind of Islamic utopia, that they were the alternatives to the corrupt, repressive, inefficient governments that were in power. And of course, things have been changing in the last 20 years, and now they are largely discredited in the two countries. I already have a co-authored article with a Greek colleague who's in Britain right now, and we wrote about Islamist political engagement in Algeria and Sudan. It's still in the pipeline. I mean, it's not published yet, but we already submitted. So again, you can see that things are now different, but this is how Islamists work. Yeah, this is where, let's put it this way, this is how ideologues work. Any movement that has an ideological background or even pretends to have an ideological background would actually try to portray itself as offering the alternative. Yeah. So the more the suffering, the more the grievances of ordinary citizens in any country, whether it be MENA, Latin America, or even the EU, that would actually play a huge role in the recruitment process.
Now, since we're talking about socio-political challenges and the security challenges and so on, did COVID-19 put more pressure on, like, first of all, the authorities? It even like showcased like they're completely unable to provide anything, and subsequently meaning that the social conditions, socioeconomic conditions in these countries deteriorated further, providing even more fertile ground for jihadist ideology, you know, to progress, despite the fact that we see everywhere in the news that ISIS has been defeated or XYZ actor has been killed or assassinated. Does this mean that the problem is solved or that the danger does not exist anymore? I doubt that.
Yeah, well, according to many reports by the World Bank, by the IMF, by even the European Union, the COVID-19 pandemic already put much pressure on the economies of MENA, even the rich ones. Mm-hmm. And I mean, even the oil-producing rich Gulf monarchies. We already heard about the austerity measures in Saudi Arabia, and like, you know, there is a challenge in Gulf countries when it comes to diversifying the economy. Like, some of them had already improved the situation and they have more diversified economies. But in many instances, a blow to oil prices or to oil exports would actually hit hard on these economies. So, of course, I don't have to maybe reiterate something that's widely known, which is the poor or the MENA countries with economic hardships, like Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, are different, or they have different, more severe challenges compared to the rich Gulf countries. But at the same time, the COVID put some pressure, both politically and economically. This is not just about the money. It's also about politics, because in many instances, if you want to criticize government policies on how to control the pandemic, how to combat it, how to fight it, maybe you will have, you will be facing trouble. And the emergency laws, putting the country under emergency, has been reported that in some MENA countries actually used the pandemic in order to extend emergency laws and like have things more or less repressed, like people are not free to do what they want to do in terms of criticizing the government. So yes, there has been the challenge with and of course, economically, we don't have to say about the job opportunities, the unemployment, the soaring prices, the real burden on the medical sector, on the health sector, that you have, let's put it this way in order to have a pattern, you have economies that are either chronically suffering from unemployment and inflation, or you have the economies of the Gulf monarchies, which are having the structural trouble of diversification. And both ways, with, of course, different degrees and intensities, the COVID pandemic is really putting pressure across the region, with economic losses, with the oil prices actually going down, that it is putting pressure on the health sectors that are not capable, like don't compare it to what's going on in Europe or even in China. Like things are getting very stable in terms of the pandemic control, in terms of the vaccination. But in these countries, things are not that smooth. And people, of course, are dissatisfied in many instances with what's going on in terms of how the governments are combating the pandemic.
I always try to finish the podcast on a positive note, or at least as positive as possible. So following the path that you followed in your paper, you're asking in the final chapter, what can be done? And I will ask the same question to you, what can be done? And if you can provide like on a kind of bullet points of like some key areas that the EU can work in order to, let's say, improve the response towards like terrorist or jihadist threats.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Andreas. That's a very good concluding question, because this is actually why I wrote the paper. Mm-hmm. I actually wrote it in specific for the ENC analysis. It's not a paper that I published before. And I did it in like on purpose. I wrote it because I thought it is worth giving advice on how the EU should tackle. It's bifolded. Of course, go on with the security measures, go on with developing the security strategies. That should be no problem. But at the same time, the EU has to think about more commitments to its ideals, because the EU is more or less about European values. And this is not just about being moral or being ethical. This is actually very pragmatic. The EU has to spend more effort in putting pressure on repressive regimes to minimize the repression, to adopt political reform, because this is how they thrive. This is how the terrorist organizations thrive. So they have the tools. The EU, I mean, its organizations, different institutions, would actually have some means to put pressure on MENA governments to undergo reform. But at the same time, if there is a way to help, they don't have to take more refugees. This is not what I'm asking for. It's more or less helping to improve the standard of living of the MENA citizens, to maybe reduce the people who are threatened by extreme poverty. They have the numbers. We all have the numbers. So again, what I said at the very start of the podcast, it was more or less a non-security perspective, because yes, security studies are very valuable and they do offer useful information and perspectives on how to combat terrorism. But because we already know that it has been going on for years, and that this year, like 2020 to be precise, and 2019, and I mean, this is not coming to an end. Terrorists will work, jihadists, speaking particularly about the Islamic militancy or Islamist militancy to be precise, they still exist and they can still hit European targets. So maybe a non-security perspective would help.
Thank you very much, Ebtisam, for the recommendations. I think at this point, our discussion has come to an end. I would like to take the opportunity to thank you once again for being virtually present, and I hope we'll have the chance to meet each other in person at some point. when you're closer to Europe or we're closer to where you are. Many thanks for this excellent discussion and for the paper that you produced, which for our those who are listening to our podcast, you can find it on our website at www.encouncil.org. Once again, thank you very much, Ebtisam. It was a pleasure to have you here.
It was my pleasure, Andreas, and thanks for the time and for publishing my paper.
I'm Andreas Marazis, and that was the ENC In Depth podcast.